these things. Amen.
A number of years ago, I won't mention how many years ago, I was a youth minister at a small church in northwest Fort Worth, Texas. And I had a couple there that I was good friends with. And they were very, very helpful. They had an above-ground pool, and we would have pool parties there with the youth a lot. They helped out with the youth the whole time. And I spent a lot of time working at their house and spending time with them, just really enjoyed their company. And the time came when, as it did in years past, when we had to change our insurance for the church, and we had to start doing background checks on everyone. And this gentleman did not want to get a background check, which should have raised red flags for us, as we all know nowadays. But for us then, it wasn't that big of a deal because he was one of those anti-government kind of people that didn't want to give out a social security number to the government kind of thing. So we didn't think anything about it. We just told him, you're not going to be able to help with the youth anymore. And he was fine with that. And we were kind of sad, but didn't think anything about it. A little while later, found out that gentleman was arrested for child pornography on his work computer. And then dug a little bit deeper and come to find out he actually had an allegation years earlier. And I thought I knew that guy. And it felt like such a terrible betrayal to me. And it hurts even now, to this day, to think that. You look on TV today, and in the midst of the Me Too movement, we have on top of that the Church Too movement. Have you seen that? Church Too, where the heroes of our faith are committing horrendous, terrible sins against people. So the Catholic Church, of course, we've known for years the conspiracies and the terrible scandals that have been going on there. But even in the Protestant church, even in the Baptist church, it's just as prevalent. And it's been covered up for years. And we see these great men who have done great things we thought for the kingdom fall terribly because of the sin that they had done and covered up. And it wounds us, and it hurts us deeply, not just as a people, but as a church and as a community, to have that trust broken. And thus our heroes fall. But we are broken because we put our trust in human beings. Because as the song at the beginning said, Jesus is better. Jesus is better than all of them. Jesus is better than us. Jesus is better than life. Better than anything that we can even comprehend. Anything that bothers us, anything that we worry about in this present reality. Jesus is better. We spent this last couple of weeks talking about Jesus healing the blind man. And we talked about that issue of suffering and suffering for Jesus' sake. And we talked last week about, is it worth it to follow Jesus? All the persecution, all the suffering that it could bring, all the shame and disgrace it might bring for those that will ridicule you, those that will bring the pain, the suffering upon you. Is it worth it? And of course we answer with a resounding yes. And I told Christy after that sermon last week, I said, you know what? It was an okay sermon, but I feel like I didn't answer the question sufficiently. I said, is Jesus worth it? Yes, Jesus is worth it, but I didn't say why he's worth it. And then I read the next passage. And I said, never mind, the Bible's got me covered. Because here we are, we're going to see why Jesus is worth it. And it's because Jesus is better than anything on this earth. Jesus is better in so many different ways. And so we're going to look at a somewhat familiar passage. You've probably heard some of these quotes before, but we're going to look at it in a slightly different context. And so turn with me to chapter 10 of John, verses 1 through 21. Truly, truly, I say to you, he who does not enter the sheepfold by the door, but rather climbs in by another way, that man is a thief and a robber. But he who enters by the door is the shepherd of the sheep. To him the gatekeeper opens. The sheep hear his voice, and he calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. And when he has brought them out, all of his own, he goes before them, and the sheep follow him, for they know his voice. A stranger they will not follow, but they will flee from him, for they do not know the voice of strangers. This figure of speech Jesus used with them, but they did not understand what he was saying to them. And so, to give you the context, once again, this is all in the context of the healing of the man who was born blind. And remember, Jesus rubbed the mud in his eyes, and he washed in the pool of Siloam, and he could see, and all the neighbors were astonished. They brought him before the Pharisees and the religious leaders, and they were like, hey, how did this happen to you? Well, this man Jesus. What do you say about him? He's a prophet. No, this man's a sinner. Well, I don't know if he's a sinner or not. One thing I know, I was blind and now I can see. They said, well, we don't know where this man comes from. How could that be? No one in history has ever healed a man born blind. No one's ever heard of this before. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. And they reviled him, and they cast him out and excommunicated him out of the synagogue, and not just out of the church services, so to speak, but out of the life. He's basically ostracized and shunned from the Jewish community. And when Jesus heard that he had been kicked out, he came to him and said, do you believe in the Son of Man? And he said, sir, who is it that I may believe in him? He's ready to trust. And he says, I'm him. And he fell down at his feet and worshipped him and said, Lord, I believe. And Jesus says, I came to give sight to the blind, but those that see are the ones that are truly blind. And the Pharisees were standing there, and he says, oh, are we blind too? Well, if you say you can see, then you're guilty. If you admitted that you were blind, then you would be innocent. But since you say you see, your guilt remains. And it's in the context of this statement that he goes on into this. This is not a whole separate thing. This is continuing that same thought here. And he tells them this parable, this figure of speech, it says in my Bible, this parable, this illustration, if you will, about the sheep. And he says, I tell you, the one that does not enter the sheepfold by the door, but goes in by another way. What's another way? How do you get in other than the door? By the front gate. You dig under the wall, you climb over the wall, you dig a hole through the wall, you sneak in. It says, the one that sneaks in the back way is a thief and a robber. Only the one that enters in by the front door is the one that owns the sheep. So let's talk about sheep. Why does he use this sheep illustration? And you'll see this all throughout the Bible. And guys, we, human beings, are described more often as sheep than anything else. Now, how many of you have sheep? I know some of you have had sheep. I've seen sheep at some of these livestock shows. Are sheep beautiful animals? Not really. Yeah, let's put up that picture. We always have this image of the Snow White, beautiful, cute, look at, everybody go, oh, this cute little white lamb. And so when Jesus is the shepherd and he's got those sheep, and we're like, yes, that's me, that beautiful white fluffy little lamb. No, this is more what we look like. Yeah. Or this one. Yeah. Or my favorite one, this one. Now, everyone, I want you to sear this image in your mind because you will have nightmares tonight about it. I've already had some serious problems with this image. Yeah. This is what sheep are like in real world. I like the one preacher said it's the 3D effect. They are dirty, they are dumb, and they are defenseless. Dirty, dumb, defenseless. Well, that pretty much describes us, doesn't it? We start out thinking that we're all white and fluffy, but every time we sin, we're getting more and more dirty, and all that stuff, all the impurities, all the dirt, all that stuff just sticks to our wool. And we're just dirty and filthy walking all around. And everywhere we go, and then we corrupt other sheep with our sinfulness and our wickedness and our filth that we're just rubbing up on their wool too. And then we're pretty dumb too, aren't we? How many times has God told us not to do this? And what do? I want to do that anyway. And that's why I read a book about it. It was talking about a shepherd's guide to sheep. And it was a man who was a pastor, was formerly actually a shepherd in the Middle East. And he says, look, let me tell you about the stupidity of sheep. They were literally, if you have a flock of sheep and they're over here, and one sheep wanders off over here, and he can't see the flock behind him, he will start crying out that he's lost. That's pretty dumb. And the shepherd has to go over there, turn them around. Oh, there they are. Okay. Yeah. How many of you like being called sheep now? No, we don't like to be called dirty and dumb. They're also defenseless and completely dependent upon the shepherd. As we said, you know what would happen to that sheep that got lost over there and couldn't find the flock? Do you know what would happen to him if the shepherd hadn't gotten him? He would have died. He would have stood there crying until he died of starvation because he's completely dependent upon the shepherd. To me, this is a great argument against evolution, because if evolution were true, how in the world did dumb sheep ever make, survival of the fittest, right? Completely dependent upon the shepherd. And they've always been that way. It's not like they evolved from some great, noble beast in the past. No, they've always been that in the history of sheep. They've always been dirty, dumb, and dependent, and completely defenseless. They get that wool stuck in the thorns and the thistles, and they can't get out. That's how the Bible describes us. And it was a metaphor, an illustration that those people could understand in that day, because that was their primary, one of their primary jobs. I mean, when we talk about a blue-collar job in today's society, that was the blue-collar job. You were a shepherd, or you were a fisherman, something to that effect. But shepherd was a very, very common job in that day and age in Jesus' land. All right? And so he's speaking to them in terms that they can understand. He says, look, y'all are the sheep. Understand that you're dirty, you're dumb, you're defenseless, you're completely dependent upon the shepherd. And now look at this. He says, the one that does not enter the sheepfold by the door. What is a sheepfold? It's where the sheep are. Yeah, there's two different types of sheep pens, if you will, in ancient times. There is a rather large, fortified sheepfold where upwards of a dozen or more flocks could be housed for the night. This is the first one that he's talking about here. And we know this because the rest of this illustration that he gives tells us, because this is what they would do. They'd have these great fortified walls. They would put them in for the night so that they would be protected from robbers and from wolves and bears and things like that. And so they would go out with their flocks during the day, and they would go out and graze, and they would come back into the sheepfold with a dozen other different flocks, and they would be put in for the night, and the door would be locked. There would be a gatekeeper who would watch and keep watch over the flocks that night. All right? And then what they would do, and I mean, think about it, that there's no separated pens inside. It's just a giant walled pen. There's dozens of different flocks, and they're all in there. And what they would do is they come out in the morning, they unlock the gate, they open the gate, and all the sheep come out, and how are they supposed to separate them out? The shepherd would say, come over here, come on. They do some kind of call, and the sheep, what?
Here.
Knew his voice. They know the voice of the shepherd, and his sheep and only his sheep would follow him. Isn't that amazing? The dumbest creatures on earth knew the sound of the shepherd's voice, and they would follow that shepherd out. And so you'd have 12, 13, 14 different shepherds all calling in different voices all at the same time, and all of their sheep would follow their shepherd. And that's what Jesus is saying here. He's saying, look, the one who enters in by the front gate, who enters in by the door, that is the true shepherd. The gatekeeper knows him, he opens it up, the sheep know him, they listen to his voice, and they follow him. They will not follow the voice of strangers. Anybody else that tries to enter in by other means is not the shepherd. They are robbers and thieves. Now, in the context of who he's talking to, remember he's talking to the Pharisees here, talking to the Jewish leaders. What is he trying to say? Who's the shepherd in this parable? Yeah, Jesus is the shepherd. Who are the robbers and the thieves in this parable? The Jewish leaders, yes. He's saying, you're trying to steal the sheep by the wrong means. He's calling them false shepherds, as he does numerous times throughout all the Gospels. He's calling them false shepherds because look at how they had just dealt with one of the sheep. That they should have rejoiced with him in this great miracle and given praise and honor to God. Instead, they ridiculed him, reviled him, and cast him out. They were bad shepherds. And so he's saying, no, you're a robber and a thief. You're trying to enter in by different means. The way they're trying to enter in is by legalism. What is legalism? Yeah, the letter of the law rather than the spirit of the law. They're missing the point. And they're focusing on the policies and the traditions of man rather than the compassion and the grace of God. He says, you are so focused on doing this little tiny little bits, but you have neglected mercy. He says to them in Luke. You should have done these other things and this as well, but you have neglected mercy and compassion. And so, no, they are robbers and thieves. And so he calls out to his sheep and they follow him. And then look at this in verse 7. They didn't understand what he was saying to them. And so he says to them again in verse 7, Truly, truly, I say to you, I am the door of the sheep. All who came before me were thieves and robbers, but the sheep did not listen to them. I am the door. If anyone enters by me, he will be saved, and I will go in and out and find pasture. The thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy, but I come that they may have life and have it abundantly. Jesus says, I am the door to the sheep. Now, if you remember, I said there's two different kinds of sheep pens. This is the second type that he's talking about here. The first one was the large one, where multiple flocks would be. The second one is a smaller pen that was just made, as you can see in this picture here, of just rocks. And is there a door? Yeah, there's a doorway there, but is there a gate? No, and this was a common thing. I don't know if you can see. Who is that in the doorway? Yeah, it's the shepherd. The shepherd lays in the opening of the pen. That was a common thing that they would do, especially the poorer shepherds that had a smaller flock. Why would the shepherd lay in the doorway? Yeah, two reasons. Number one, so that the sheep can't get out and wander off and get eaten. And number two, so that nobody can get the sheep. He is the guardian. He is, in a sense, the door to the sheep pen. Do you get it now? This is what Jesus is saying. He says, I am that shepherd. I am the door. I am the gate. My sheep are held in by me. No one can snatch them out of the Father's hands. I will take all the ones that the Father has given to me. No one will take my sheep away from me. He is the ones that keep the sheep in. He is the one that keep the wolves at bay. Amen. Jesus is the door. Now I want you to notice what is specific about that statement. If Jesus is the door, if Jesus is the gateway in and out, what does that mean? There is only one way. Notice there's no other entries into this place. Only the one door. And Jesus is that door and that gateway. Later on in chapter 14, he's going to say, when the disciples are saying, we don't know where you're going, how can we know the way? And Jesus says, I am the way. I am the truth. I am the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. In chapter 11, we'll see in a little bit, in chapter 11, when he raises Lazarus from the dead, Dixie did a great job of talking about this yesterday. When he raises Lazarus up, he says to his sister, I am the resurrection and the life. Those that believe in me, even though they are dead, will yet live again. All throughout the book of John, he has said these statements, I am, I am, I am. You see several of them here. He said, I am, ego I me is the Greek. It's a common phrase used by Jesus, making reference to that statement all the way back in Exodus when God told Moses what his name was. He says, I am that I am. When you go to the Jews, tell them that the great I am has sent you. And that's what that word means, I am. When he's walking on the water towards them and they say, it's a ghost. And Jesus says, fear not. And in most translations it says, it is me. Literally what it says is, fear not, I am. He says, I am, a little bit, the true vine. I am the door to the sheep, as we're going to see in just a second. I am the good shepherd. Jesus is saying who he is in no uncertain terms here. He is explaining to them that he is the only way to salvation. Those that come, he says, now look at this, this is interesting. He says, all those who came before me are thieves and robbers, and the sheep did not listen to them. Now, I read a lot of different commentaries, and they were all trying to do some interesting finagling. Y'all know what finagling means? That's one of those fun words, finagling. Doing some, jumping around, trying to make this work, because they were thinking, oh, well, he's talking about all the other prophets that's come before him. I don't think that's what he's saying. What did Jesus just say? He is what? The door. He says, I am the door. He says, all others who have come before me claiming to be what? The door are robbers and thieves. I don't think he's talking about Moses and Abraham and the Old Testament prophets. No. He's saying all those false messiahs, all the ones that have come before me claiming to be the gate, claiming to be the door, claiming to be the good shepherd, they were robbers and thieves. Now, when Jesus came, if you know anything about history, the time period that Jesus came, there was an enormous amount of messiahs rising up constantly. There were numerous revolts against Rome. In fact, there was a big revolt that came out of Sepphoris, which is just a few miles from Nazareth. That's why some commentators think when he talked to Nathanael, and remember Nathanael says, out of Nazareth, can anything good come out of Nazareth? There was a huge revolt up there with a false Messiah that raised up this rebel group, and they went up against the Romans and tried to defeat them, and they were put down. In the book of Acts, the great Rabbi Gamaliel says, look, this guy Judas got up and said he was a Messiah, said he was somebody. A bunch of people followed him, and when he was put to death, followers scattered. This other guy rose up as a false Messiah, and people followed him. When he was put to death, the followers scattered. And he says about this Jesus fellow, he says, look, if this is of God, or if this is of man, then it's going to fall apart. If it's of God, then you can't stop it. And so his advice to them was to just leave it alone. Of course, we know how that went. The movement continued to thrive. But there were numerous false messiahs that had risen up. And so Jesus is basically saying here, look, all these other people that have popped up saying they're going to deliver you, they're robbers and thieves. In a literal sense, very much, because they would usually, raise up these rebellions. They weren't working a job. How do you think they fed themselves? Robbing their own people. They would steal, kill, and destroy and rob their own people in order to get the things that they needed. And they felt like the people should support them because they're out here fighting the Romans on their behalf. Now, meanwhile, you're a poor little shepherd or poor little farmer down here, and these people keep raiding you and stealing your stuff. How do you feel about them? No, they're robbers and thieves. And so in a very real, literal sense, that was what he's talking about. But in a spiritual sense, even more so, because remember, he's talking to the Jewish leaders. He's saying, look, you guys keep propping yourselves up as the answer. You keep propping yourselves up as the way to go, but you're just liars and thieves and robbers just like they are. And so it says, yes, all those that came before came to kill, steal, and destroy, but I came to give you what? Life. And life more abundantly, or life to the fullest. Not just a life. Not just, I'm alive, I'm breathing, I'm kind of here. No. Life in the fullest sense. Abundant life. And he talks about the sheep going in and out, and being out into the pasture, and being able to graze freely. Then look at this. Verse 11. Here's that other I am. I am the good shepherd. I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. He who is a hired hand and not the shepherd, does not own the sheep, sees a wolf coming and leaves the sheep and flees, and the wolf snatches them and scatters them. He flees because he is a hired hand and cares nothing for the sheep. So, you have the shepherd that owns the sheep, who will give up his life for them, and then you have the hired hand, who will do what? Who will abandon them at the first sign of trouble. Why? Because he doesn't own the sheep, he doesn't care about the sheep, he has no connection to the sheep. Now, this is not necessarily talking about religious leaders per se, it's talking about the awesome superiority of the good shepherd. Jesus is saying, I'm the good shepherd. I'm the better option because I know the sheep. He says, Nathaniel, he says, I knew you when you were sitting under the tree. He says, Zacchaeus, come down, before he had ever met him. Jesus knows the sheep. He knows them. He has a personal connection, a personal relationship with each and every one of his sheep. He knows them and he's willing to lay down his life for them. The hired hands, they're just doing it for what reason? For the money. Yeah. They have no connection to the sheep. Now, certainly there are under-shepherds in the world today that are shepherding flocks only for the money. I think primarily all those health and wealth, prosperity gospel guys. Oh, God told me you need to give me $2 million for my new private jet. I'm going to see if that works here sometime. You know, guys, I really would like a Ferrari. God has told me that you need to buy me a Ferrari, so y'all need to get on that. Y'all are chuckling. Y'all don't take that seriously. I'm God's anointed. Don't you want to help me out? No. No, we don't. No. The under-shepherds exist to serve the sheep and to serve the master, great shepherd. The sheep do not exist to serve the shepherds. Right? Those that have come before were robbers and thieves. They were looking for their own benefit. But Jesus is better than all of them. He says he lays down his life for the sheep, right? He says in verse 14, I am the good shepherd. I know my own, and my own know me. Just as the Father knows me, and I know the Father, and I lay down my life for the sheep. And then look at this. I have other sheep that are not of this fold. I must bring them in also, and that they will listen to my voice, so that there will be one flock, one shepherd. That seems like a rather odd interjection in the middle of this thought. What are these other sheep that he's got to bring in? Yeah, look around the room. Us, Gentiles, non-Jewish people. Right? Yeah, the Gentiles. He's got to bring in the other flock that's going to come in. And they're all going to be one flock together under one shepherd, Jesus. And it's for this reason the Father loves me, because I lay down my life that I may take it up again. Listen to this. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down of my own accord. I have authority to lay it down, and I have the authority to take it up again. This charge I have received from my Father. Jesus says, I lay down my life freely. So 3 things I want you to notice about this. Number 1, he lays down his life voluntarily. No one takes it from him, he says. No one takes it from me. I do this of my own free will. Now, I've heard there's all sorts of liberal scholars out there that say, oh, Jesus, was trying to start this revolution against the Romans, and the Romans killed him for it, and yada, yada. No. Nobody killed Jesus. I mean, all you have to do is read the Gospels of how many times they tried to kill him, and he did what? He escaped. At one point in Nazareth, he just walks out of the midst of them. They're trying to grab hold of him. I always imagine it's like that, those cartoons, when the big piles jump on and the little guy comes out the bottom. Yeah. That's how I imagine. They're all trying to grab Jesus, and they're going to throw him off the cliff, and Jesus just walks out of the midst of them. It's like, bye, guys. They tried to stone him back in chapter 8, we saw, and it says he went away, and they couldn't find him. Time and time again, they can't touch him, they can't lay hands upon him, because he says, it's not yet my time. When it was his time, he lays down his life on his own free will. No one takes it from him. He says, I have the authority to lay it down. And he lays it down for whom? For us, for the sheep. He says, I lay down my life for the sheep. He lays it down voluntarily. He lays it down for us, for the sheep. And he also lays it down with the understanding that he will take it up again. He's not just sacrificing his life. He says, I have the authority to lay it down, but I have the authority to do what? To take it up again, the resurrection, so that he will be victorious as well. Well, now everybody's really confused. Look at the division that breaks out here in verse 19. There was again division among the Jews because of these words. Many of them says, this guy has a demon, he's insane, why should we listen to him? But others were saying, these are not the words of one who is oppressed by a demon, and can a demon open the eyes of the blind? So once again, there's this indecision, there's this confusion, there's this discussion and this division among the Jewish people. And they're saying, first of all, you've got the group that's just rejecting. It's like, this guy's crazy, he's got a demon, he's insane. We should just stop listening to his ranting. And the other people are saying, look, if he's demon-possessed, he couldn't be healing the blind man. Like the blind man said, if this man were not from God, he could do nothing. And so they're saying that there's confusion among them. But I want you to look at this. At every point in this passage, there's this statement that Jesus is saying. This is the underlying theme of this entire passage that we looked at today, and it's that Jesus is better. Number one, Jesus is better than our heroes. I talked about at the beginning those heroes of our faith and those great pastors that we've looked up to, right? Now, I'm a pastor. I actually listen to a lot of other pastors. I read a lot of pastorally blogs. I read a lot of sermons and things from a lot of different pastors. And there's a lot of big-name speakers out there. But I have to be careful not to admire them too much, because why? Because they're human beings and they're flawed. And if I set myself up too much, then they're going to fall off that pedestal real quick. Look at what the Jewish people said in chapter 8 and chapter 9. They said, we are the children of Abraham. Abraham is our hero. Jesus says, I'm better than Abraham. They say, we are disciples of Moses in chapter 9. We follow Moses. And Jesus says, I'm better than Moses. In fact, I encourage you to go home and read the book of Hebrews. The whole book in one sitting. That's why we always do this, and it's unfortunate the format that we have to do given time constraints. But I mean, as I'm preaching through this message of John, it's been so many weeks, right? The people, when they would get these, they didn't sit there and break them apart. The book of Hebrews was written as a letter to the people, and they would sit down and read it as one whole thing. I believe it was a sermon, possibly a sermon of Paul's that was written down. It certainly has the cadence and the feel of a sermon. And the entire theme of the book of Hebrews is, guess what? Jesus is better. In the beginning it says, Jesus is better than the angels. Jesus is better than the Old Testament covenant. Jesus is better than Abraham. Jesus is better than Moses. Even Moses said, there's one who's going to come after me in Deuteronomy. There's one who's going to come after me that's better than me. The prophet that is greater than Moses. Hebrews says Jesus is better, a better sacrifice than all the sacrifices before. He is a better high priest than all the high priests before. The entire book of Hebrews, Jesus is better. He's better than their heroes. He's better than our heroes. It may not be religious heroes. It may be sports heroes. It may be politicians. It may be celebrities. Anyone that we hold up to this ideal of who we admire and look up to is an idol and a false god that can never satisfy us, because only one can satisfy us. Jesus Christ, who is better than all. He's better than our heroes. He's better than our wealth. There are millions of poor people all over the world who have trusted in Jesus Christ, and you know what every one of them would say? I would rather have Jesus than $1 million. Where'd Andrew go? I was going to say, we went on Sunday night last week to this wild game night up at Ash Street, and Bradley Clay was the speaker there. He does a hunting show, and they do a devotion at the end of the hunting show, and a great speaker. And he got up there and he was talking about this guy he knew from high school. And he was back in the Edmond area, and this guy called him up and said, hey, I'm here in the area too, let's meet up. I haven't seen you in 10, 15 years. They used to be good friends in high school. And so he meets up with him and he says, this guy rolls in a $180,000 Land Rover. He talks about he made $9 million last year as the 10th best salesman for this international company. $9 million in 1 year that he made. And of course, Bradley's sitting there. He's like, I'm I'm basically a minister on TV. It's like not everybody on TV makes a lot of money. I don't have a lot of money. I was a youth minister and I did this, And so he's like, why are you rubbing this in my face? He's like, I have a yacht. He's like, I have a house in Florida. He says, I was down speaking in Rio de Janeiro at this conference, and I loved it so much, I just bought a house there overlooking the giant, Jesus statue. And Bradley's like, why are you rubbing this in my face? And he says, I'm telling you all this because I want you to know I am miserable. And he says, I've looked back across my life. He said, there was a time when I was working a great job and the stock market crashed and I lost my job and I was poor as dirt. And then I got on this job and I lived in poverty and drugs for months. And then I got this job, and then I was living at the Heights with a $9 million salary and 3 vacation homes and a 60-foot yacht. And he says, not at any point in any of these intervening years have I felt contentment and peace. And I began to look back on my life, he said, the only time I can remember being genuinely peaceful and happy was when I was going to church with you. And I wanted you to tell me, what am I missing? And Bradley told us that to tell us, he got to, proclaim the gospel to him, and that man became saved. Just to show wealth doesn't lead to happiness. How many millionaires have committed suicide? Jesus is better than wealth. Jesus is better than our relationships. So many people put their trust in their relationship with their loved ones, whether it be their spouse, whether it be their family, whether it be their children. They invest so much in those relationships. But guys, apart from God, that relationship is nothing. Remember that illustration I told you one time about the triangle? It's more than just you and your spouse. It's you, your spouse, and God. You make sort of a trinity. And as you and your spouse are getting closer to God at the point of that triangle, what's happening to you two? You're getting closer together as well. God is the common factor and the common denominator in every relationship. And if you put your relationship ahead of God and ahead of Christ, it's going to fail you time and time again. Anybody ever been mad at their spouse? Anybody ever felt betrayed by your spouse? Anybody ever felt let down by your spouse? Now, I'm not going to raise my hand because my wife has never let me down. But I'm sure I've let her down many times. Right? Because we're all human and we're sinful and we fail. Jesus is better. Jesus is better. He's better than comfort. Now, this is a real problem for us in this country. We're all about our comfort. How many of you got that lazy boy recliner? Lift your hand. Hey, testify with me. I got my lazy boy recliner. I've told my children I love it more than I love them. Because they like to get in my chair too, and they eat, and they get crumbs and food all over it. And I tell them not to sit in my chair anymore. Right? We love our comfort and our ease. But Jesus is better than that. Why are there so many Christians who give up everything that they have, the comfort and the ease that they have in America, to go to Africa or some village in South America? Because they feel called of God. And you know what? They're not miserable. They're not going, man, I sure miss my lazy boy recliner. No. They are comforted in that peace because they are doing what God wants them to do, because Jesus is better than that. And lastly, Jesus is better than our religion. Can I get an amen? We live in a culture and an age that is the young adults and the younger generation is very, very skeptical and suspicious of any sort of organized institution, particularly the church. And I have to tell you, I'm not sure they're wrong. Because the church has failed in so many ways throughout history. I mean, you guys know I love history, and I know so many people don't like history, and they don't want to read about it, they don't want to study about it, but guys, you really need to study history so you don't repeat the same mistakes over and over and over, because we do constantly, and the church repeats the same mistakes over and over and over. In some ways, the Protestant Reformation and the Protestant movement of which we are a part is going down the same path as the Roman Catholics did, elevating traditions over the Scripture. We have to be very, very careful about religion. Now, hear me, I'm not saying don't go to church. You'll never hear me say that because that's not what Jesus says. Jesus says, I love the church. I died for the church. I was resurrected for the church. I established the church. I want you to go to church. I'm saying don't put your faith in an institution. Put your faith in Christ. How many people have been hurt by the church? You don't have to raise your hand. How many people have been hurt by this church? People will fail you. People will hurt you. People in the church, oftentimes, are not better than anybody else in the world, and sometimes are even worse than how you would be treated by the world. Institutions will fail you. Institutions will let you down. People will fail you and let you down. But Jesus will never fail because Jesus is better. Jesus says he is the door. You know, it's interesting. It's easier to step through a door, to walk through a door, than it is to get in any other way. Think about that. If you wanted to enter into this sanctuary, what would be the easiest way to get in this building? Yeah, what are some other ways you might get in? The windows? What you're going to have to do to get through the windows? Yeah. What about the wall? And that's solid brick, man. That's hard to get through. You're going to need a jackhammer, sledgehammer or something, right? What if you climbed up on the roof and tried to get in through the roof? Yeah, that's a metal roof up there. Good luck with that. Right? What if you climbed up on the second floor over there and tried to bust in a window? Some of them kind of got bars on them. It's hard to get in. Isn't it interesting that Jesus says, you know, the gate is wide and the way is broad that leads to destruction, but the door is narrow and the path is narrow that leads to eternal life, and few will find it. The door into eternal life is very, very small. There's not a broad range of options. There's not, oh, well, I can believe in Zen Buddhism, or I can believe in Hinduism, or I can believe this, or I can believe this, or I can believe this. There's no buffet religion that's going to meet and satisfy and bring salvation. Jesus says there's only one door, one little tiny narrow door. And only few people are going to find it. And the reason they're going to find it is because they were what? Looking for it. Most people aren't looking. But then there's something else that has to happen too. Once you get to that door, what do you have to do? Pick the lock. I would suggest try knocking first. Knock on the door. You have to knock on the door. You have to humble yourself to ask if I can come in. Some people find the door, but can't humble themselves enough to ask Jesus to let them in because of their pride. Guys, I want to talk to you today about this door. I don't want you to leave here today thinking that you have all the time in the world. I don't want you to leave here today thinking that there is some other way. There is no other way. You know, when all those disciples turned away in John chapter 6, and he looks at his 12 and he says, do you want to leave too? And Peter stands up and he says, Lord, where else can we go? For there is no other words of eternal life from anywhere else. He tells us in Acts, there's no other name under heaven given unto man by which we must be saved. There's no other way but Jesus, who is the door and the gate. There's no other way. There's no, I'm going to live a good enough life. I'm going to be a good enough person. I'm going to get to heaven. I'm going to say, hey, look at all the good things I did. No. The Bible tells us all of your good deeds are filthy rags before God. Your righteousness is worthless in the eyes of God. Your good deeds are nothing because they are marred and dirty and pathetic like those sheep. That's like that filthy, dirty sheep covered in just, nasty poop and dirt and everything, going up and saying, look at all the good deeds that I did. It's like, no, you got dirt and mud everywhere. Our good deeds are worthless apart from Christ. Only He can clean us up and make our deeds worth something. There's no other way but by Christ. Because Jesus is better. So why is Jesus worth it? Because why? Jesus is better. Say it with me. Jesus is better than anything in this life, if you don't know Him, if you've not found the door, if you found the door but you're too prideful to knock and ask, get over it. You have no hope outside of Christ. None whatsoever. Humble yourself, knock on that door, and enter into the sheepfold. And the good shepherd who will lay down his life, who has already laid down his life for you, will comfort you and give you peace. The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. He makes me to lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside the still waters. He restores my soul. He makes me walk in the paths of righteousness for His name's sake. And yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. For Thou art with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepared a place for me in the presence of my enemies. You have anointed my head with oil. My cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Let's stand, every head bowed. Father God, You are the good shepherd. You are the shepherd that has laid down His life for the sheep. All others that have come before were false prophets, false messiahs. All those that exist today that say that they are the way, Lord, may the sheep not listen to their voice. May they only listen to Yours. You are the doorway. We who have entered in have entered into Your rest. May we rest in You. May we trust in You for our daily sustenance, our daily bread, our daily livelihood, our daily relationships. May we trust in You to provide for us as You always have as the Good Shepherd. For those that are outside the sheepfold, I pray that they find the door. I pray, Lord, that Your Spirit guide them to the entryway, that they would humble themselves before You and knock and admit that they can't do it on their own. They need You to let them in. Father, I pray that they do that today. May Your name be praised. And all God's people said, Amen. You come this morning as we sing.